Good morning and welcome to the National D-Day Memorials Lunchbox Lecture. My name is John Long, the Director of Education here at the Memorial. Maggie Hartley, my colleague, is behind the computer screen making all the magic happen. And we are delighted to have you join us for our virtual program. As you know, we have done these Lunchbox Lectures virtually for most of the year. Last year, we did them in person, and we have discovered that there's a whole new audience out there when we offer them live. Not only many people watching, but gives us an opportunity to have speakers from all over the country and well-known speakers such as our speaker today. Get to that in just a moment. I want to open though on a little bit of a somber note and mention the passing of one of our World War II veterans who was often here at the National D-Day Memorial for programs. Russ Robinson passed away the other day at age 97. He was a B-24 Liberator pilot in the European theater during the war and would often come to speak to children. Here he is pictured in our old tent before we had our Quonset hut, speaking to children about his role in the war. Russ's funeral was today, and so we would like to offer today's program in memory of Russ with thanksgiving for his life and his service. And Russ, I know you had a happy flight and a happy landing. So we will get started now. I do want to make a few announcements, upcoming events before we introduce our speaker. Our next live stream is on Tuesday, the 27th at 2 o'clock. And this is going to be a fun one, I think. Maggie and I will be offering Dinner Time in World War II, a program we're going to talk about how you fed your family during the war in the rationing system and what the men out in the field were eating during the war. And it's complete with some taste tests. And that's what Maggie is most looking forward to. You know, she has never tasted Spam in her life, but she will next Tuesday. We've also got, this one is veal and pork loaf from a K-ration. So we are looking forward to some of these taste tests and learning more about what it was like to eat dinner in World War II. Then our next Lunchbox lecture is on Thursday, November 5th at noon, and this will be Amanda Williams, our friend from the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, who will be speaking on Winning the Peace, MacArthur and the Occupation of Japan. For Veterans Day, we have a couple of programs. There will be a student live stream Monday the 9th at 12:10 with an interview with a veteran and talk about ways for kids, how they can honor our veterans of our nation. And then our veterans commemoration will be virtual. Of course, in this modern day of COVID-19, big get-togethers are not advisable. And so our way to honor the vets this year will be a virtual commemoration that will go live on our Facebook, on our YouTube page, on our website at 11 a.m. on November 11th. And it's going to be an excellent one. If you haven't seen our previous ones for Memorial Day and for June 6th, go to our webpage. They're still there, as well as many of our other previous programs. And then last upcoming event on November 19th, Thursday at 1 o'clock. April Cheek-Messier, our president, and myself will be back to our virtual book club where we will discuss a book on World War II. This offering in November will be The Splendid and the Vile, a fairly recent book by Eric Larson on Churchill and Churchill's family and the Battle of Britain. It's an excellent book. If you want to get a copy and read it ahead of time, please do. If you don't get to read the book ahead of time, join us anyway and listening to our discussion. And we are looking forward to that. So again, plenty of upcoming events. You can find out more about all of this on our webpage in the calendar and the upcoming events page. But it's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker for today, Rick Beyer. And as I said a moment ago, one advantage to the virtual programs is that we can bring in speakers that are very well known from all over the country without the inconvenience of actually, bringing people to Bedford for a lecture. We can offer this virtually. And Rick is one that we are thrilled to have with us today. Rick is a New York Times best-selling author, an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and a longtime history buff. He was the producer of The Ghost Army, a PBS documentary that co-authored with Elizabeth Sales, also The Ghost Army of World War II, a companion book. And I'm also pleased to foreshadow Rick will be our keynote speaker next June for the 77th anniversary of D-Day. And a little bit of warning well ahead of time, our commemoration next year will be on Saturday, June 5th, not on Sunday, June 6th. Saturday being the better day for a lot of people. So June 5th, Rick will be our speaker for the commemoration of the anniversary of D-Day. Rick has made a number of documentaries for the History Channel, for National Geographic, the Smithsonian Institute, is the co-host of the History Happy Hour livecast, which is seen through Stephen Ambrose's Historical Tour Facebook and YouTube pages. And most relevant to his talk today, he is the author of a series of books called The Greatest Stories Never Told, including one on great presidential stories never told, which inspires his talk today. Hail to the Chiefs. And so just before a presidential election, we're going to get a little presidential history with Rick. And we are thrilled to be able to offer this program. So Rick, welcome.
I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad you clarified that I'm not the co-host of Hippie Hour, because that would be a completely different show than History Happy Hour.
It might be an interesting show, though.
It could be, especially with the new Chicago 7 movie out there, but it is not what I am doing. So
I started to say the Hippie History Hour, which no, it's Happy History Hour.
Talking can be such a challenge sometime. Maybe there's more coffee in the pot, you know?
Well, I will need it. So great. Well, where are you today, Rick?
I am in Chicago, live from high atop, 11 floors above Michigan Avenue in Chicago, Illinois.
Excellent. And we are thrilled that you're with us today, and we'll be back with us in person come next June.
I'm very excited to be coming in June, and I'm excited to be here today. Although, it would not be an inconvenience for me to come there for this. If I ever thought of travel as an inconvenience, the last 6 months has convinced me that it is a great luxury that I yearn to return to.
Absolutely. It's same with many of us. Just be able to leave your house is a blessing.
Is a joy. Yes.
So excellent. Well, Rick, I will turn it over to you, and looking forward to what you have to tell us.
All right. Well, fantastic. And thank you very much for that great introduction, John. And, I do a lot of World War II based stuff. The Ghost Army that I wrote, I lead tours in Normandy. I've been many times to that part of Omaha Beach that the Bedford boys landed on, and with the tragic results that happened there. But I have to say that none of that has anything to do with my talk today, because this is a talk about presidents. And look, since we're 2 weeks out from an election, I'm going to start with a few carefully chosen words about our current president, Donald Trump. And what I have to say about him is this: he does not appear in this talk, and neither does his predecessor, Barack Obama, or his opponent, Joe Biden, or anybody in the news today. We are going to deal strictly with presidents of the past and hopefully have a good time doing it. So our presentation is loaded up here, we think. So let's get off to the races, okay? And let's start by heading out to the ocean. We are aboard the Mayflower. The year is 1620. A storm is raging on the North Atlantic. The wind is ferocious. A young passenger named John Howland comes up on the deck. The force of the storm sweeps him into the sea. Man overboard! He seems sure to perish. But wait, there he is. He grabs a hold of a rope trailing from the ship. He holds on for dear life. His head disappears below the surface, but men on deck eventually are able to haul him alongside and drag him up there. He looks more dead than alive, though he was something ill with it, reports another passenger. He lived many years thereafter. And at this point, you're all thinking, what's he doing? I thought this was a president's talk. Has he gone rogue? Not at all. John Howland's life is saved because he's able to grasp that rope. And by that slender thread hangs 3 presidencies. Because watching from the deck of the Mayflower that day is a 12-year-old girl named Elizabeth Tilley. Here she is. And she and John Howland would eventually marry, and they would populate the New World with 10 children, 82 grandchildren, and descendants too numerous to count. And among them, 3 presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and the 2 George Bushes, all of whom might never have been born if their ancestor hadn't been plucked from the death grip of a vengeful ocean. And that's the kind of history story that I love to tell, and the kind that I've put in the book that I wrote, The Greatest Presidential Stories Never Told. And this particular story illustrates what is to me the kind of the key maxim, the one I repeat over and over and treasure when I talk to audiences about history. The one thing about history that it's good to keep in mind: everything that ever happened almost didn't. And by the way, vice versa. John Howland could have let go. History would have been different. A small moment can be a big turning point. And history doesn't happen in the past. It happens in the present, and it's alive with possibilities. It's under pressure, in the heat of the moment, in anger, in the waves of the ocean. And it can always turn out differently. And that is what makes it, to me, ever, ever exciting. You know, a number of years ago, I was having a conversation with a young man who worked for me, and I was quizzing him about his knowledge of a certain historical event. As it happens, it was the Nuremberg trials. It came up in a job we were doing. And he said these words to me, these terrible, terrible words: "I'm not really into history." Now, if you know me, these are fighting words. And here's what I said. Well, given that history is everything that ever happened to every soul that walked the planet, the triumphs and tragedies of everyone who ever existed, given that it is filled with ambition, greed, sex, folly, intrigue, humor, what part of that, Ray, are you not into? Ray doesn't work for me anymore. We are still friends on Facebook, so it's okay. But I am into history. With a vengeance, with an enthusiasm that I'm dying to share every day, every moment of every day. Just ask anybody who knows me. And what really calls to me are quirky, little-known stories that hide in the cracks and crevices of history, but that turn out to have a surprising impact. So I'm going to share a bunch of those stories having to do with presidents. We'll get into a couple of World War II presidents in there, but not maybe from the angle you would expect. Buckle up. It's going to be quite a ride as we try to give a hail to the Chiefs. Well, let's start with our first president. I mean, that makes sense, right? So we should talk about him, the august, the revered. No, not this guy. Not George Washington. You thought George Washington was our first president? George Washington is many things, but he is not our first president. I think he's actually number 8. And no, just to clarify, I have not been engaged in any day drinking. Washington is our first president elected under the Constitution, taking office in 1789. But the United States came together as a nation years earlier, and in 1781 is when it happened, when the last of the 13 colonies ratified the Articles of Confederation. And shortly thereafter, Congress, by unanimous vote, having created a new country, makes John Hanson the first president of the United States. His actual title is President of the United States in Congress Assembled. But make no mistake, he's a real president. So he doesn't have all the powers of a president today, but he is first in the nation. He is meeting with diplomats. He's doing things that a president does. And Hanson served only a year and now is largely forgotten. But at the time, a colleague wrote to him and said, "I congratulate Your Excellency on the appointment to fill the most important seat in the United States." And that colleague who wrote that was George Washington. So, okay, that's a kind of a fun presidential story, but it's also a reminder of something pretty important, which is that things that we accept as fact may have a completely different interpretation or an interesting backstory that we don't just know. And it's why I always think it's a great idea to, when you're talking about a topic, when you're writing about a topic, to really dig in your research and not assume anything, And I just think that's critical. So George Washington becomes president when the Constitution is ratified, and he is inaugurated in Federal Hall in New York City. And if you're watching this from New York City, or if you've visited New York City, it's not the same Federal Hall that's there today. Same spot, same site, but that building that's there today was built about 40 or 50 years later. So Washington is being inaugurated. Obviously, it's a big deal, right, for this new country. So organizers plan every single detail, except they miss one. As the crowds begin to gather, they realize that nobody has thought to bring a Bible to use for taking the oath of office. Oh my gosh, panic. Who's got a Bible? Where can we get a Bible? The man who's going to give the oath, John Livingston, he's the Chancellor of New York State. He stays calm in this moment of potential crisis. He says there is a Bible in the nearby St. John's Masonic Lodge, and he knows this because he is a member. So he sends somebody to go grab the Bible. They bring it back. They literally open it to a random page. If you see in this artwork here, you see that Washington's got his hand on an open page of the Bible. They open it to a random page. Naturally, they remembered what page it was. It's a page from Genesis. And Washington recites the oath. And after reciting the oath, which is prescribed in the Constitution, Washington adds a phrase of his own at the end. So help me God, which has been a practice which has been followed by virtually every president since then. And this Bible, now known as the Washington Bible, is still in the possession of St. John's Lodge. It has been brought out for 4 inaugurations since, and it would have been used in a 5th inauguration, except the weather was really bad, so they didn't want to bring it out. They're very protective of it. I read when I was doing my research on this that they actually I think they have 4 people who travel with the Bible, 3 or 4, and they buy an extra seat for the Bible. It's in a, its protective case or whatever, extra seat, 3 guards. They are taking really, really good care of this thing. Now, after Washington is inaugurated, the Senate goes into session, and their next few weeks are taken up by a very important, pressing piece of business that is soon the subject of heated debate. And you know how the Senate is. They really focus on what's important, right? The greatest deliberative body in the world. Well, the issue here, as they're forming a new government, is how should they refer to the president? Yes, that's the pressing issue that takes up several weeks. Many people, including Vice President John Adams, think that referring to Washington as president simply isn't enough. Adams says, fire brigades and cricket clubs have presidents. He argues that Washington should have a title with more dignity and splendor. South Carolina Senator Ralph Izard proposed calling the president His Excellency. George Washington initially favors the title His High Mightiness. A Senate committee gets together. Oh, this one's going to be good, right? And comes up with a real mouthful. His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of Same. Woo! All right. So believe it or not, the Senate actually debates this 4 weeks before the House leadership basically says, forget it, boys. We're not interested in giving him a fancy title. We don't want the president to start thinking he's king. And so the simple title of president will have to suffice. And John Adams comes in for a lot of criticism for his desire to give the president a title. And Ben Franklin tweaks him a little bit by suggesting a new title for Vice President John Adams, that he should be called His Superfluous Excellency. Okay, we dealt with first president. We dealt with George Washington. Another great president comes to mind. That would be Abraham Lincoln. He's probably our most revered president next to Washington. We remember him for the Emancipation Proclamation. We remember him for the Gettysburg Address, the stovepipe hat, his homespun sense of humor. You probably don't remember him for dueling, though, do you? It's hard to imagine Abraham Lincoln standing in shirt sleeves, waving a broadsword through the air in preparation for a duel to the death. And yet, that is the scene along the Mississippi River on September 22nd, 1842. So it's 1842. It's nearly 20 years before Lincoln's going to become president. He's a lawyer and a state representative in Illinois. And the whole affair begins when a series of letters appear in a Springfield newspaper ridiculing State Auditor James Shields. Here's James Shields. The anonymous letters call Shields a dunce. I think the actual phrase is a conceited dunce, meaning a conceited dunce, a fool, and a liar. Never let people tell you that politics was more gentle in the past, okay? It was not. And then there's this line in these letters that appear in the paper about James Shields. If I were deaf and blind, I could tell him by the smell. Okay, then. Shields is furious. He confronts the editor of the paper, threatens it. Who wrote those letters? Lincoln. The editor gives it up pretty easily. So Shields challenges Abraham Lincoln to a duel. Now, some historians think the letters were not written by Lincoln. They were actually written by his fiancée at that point, Mary Todd. The wedding is still a few months off. And that Lincoln just delivered them to the editor. But in any case, Lincoln does the chivalrous thing. He accepts the challenge, and the duel is on. And Lincoln has choice of weapons. And as he tells a friend later, I did not want to kill Shields, and I did not want the damn fella to kill me. And he knows that Shields is an excellent marksman. So as his weapon, Lincoln chooses the broadsword. Cavalry broadswords. Now, what you need to know here is that Lincoln is like 6'11". No, he's not. He's 6'4". Very tall, famously very tall. And Shields is in the other direction. I think he's about 5'8". So this is likely to give Lincoln a huge advantage. And they row out to an island in the middle of the Mississippi River, which is kind of the neutral dueling ground. And Lincoln puts on a show. That's the only way I can describe it. He takes off his jacket. He starts waving around his sword. He's whacking branches off of trees high above his head. And Shields is watching this and starts to realize that maybe this is not such a good idea. And so that's, of course, exactly what Lincoln is trying to convey. So Shields tells his second, his aide for the duel, to go talk to Lincoln's second and see if they can't negotiate something. And in the end, what Lincoln always referred to as his scrape with Shields ends with a handshake instead of a killing. Funny story, but it could have ended badly for our country. And remember what we said. Everything that ever happened almost didn't. Lincoln holds no grudge against Shields, by the way. He makes him a general during the Civil War. And in fact, Shields has the distinction of being the only Union general to best Stonewall Jackson in battle. Shields is also the answer to a fabulous trivia question: who is the only person to serve as a senator from 3 different states? And Shields served as a senator from Illinois, Minnesota, and Missouri, in that order. You know, another part of the Lincoln legacy that may have escaped your attention is the great kidnapping plot. Shocking, right? What's more, these nefarious kidnappers actually managed to get their hands on the president before the plot is foiled. It doesn't seem to matter much to them that he's been dead for 10 years at the time. The year is 1876, and a counterfeiter named Ben Boyd has just been sent to prison, and his gang wants to spring him because he's the only one who can make the phony bills. So they come up with this idea. They're going to kidnap Lincoln's body from his grave and hold it for ransom. There's a reason that these guys resorted to crime instead of rocket science. The gang plans to spirit Lincoln's body out of its tomb in Springfield, Illinois, then demand that the government release Boyd and pay them $25,000 in return for Lincoln's body. And in addition, they decide to do this on election night so that no one will be around. I don't know why people would be around in the cemetery at night anyway, but anyway, they're doing it on election night. What can go wrong? But basically everything. Somebody snitches on the snatchers, and the Secret Service infiltrates the gang. And an agent and several Pinkerton detectives are waiting at the tomb, and they're ready to grab them. But then it turns into Keystone Cops time. The criminals get the body almost all the way out of the tomb before the detectives try to apprehend them. And in the gunfight that follows, the Pinkertons find themselves shooting at the Secret Service agents, and the bad guys get away. Oops. So eventually, 2 of the men in the gang that tried to kidnap the body were arrested, but they couldn't be charged with grave robbing. Why couldn't they be charged with grave robbing? Because as it turns out, in 1876, grave robbing is not a crime in Illinois. So they finally got him on a charge. They got him on a charge for stealing not the body, but the coffin. And they spent a year in jail apiece. It's a crazy story, right? The kidnapping of Lincoln's body. So we've talked about 2 great presidents, Washington and Lincoln. One more great president whose name I think resonates at the D-Day Memorial today would be Dwight D. Eisenhower. Did you know that Dwight D. Eisenhower played professional baseball? This is not him playing professional baseball. This is him throwing out a first pitch with Richard Nixon in the background. But did you know that he played professional baseball? I'll bet you didn't. And there's a reason for that, because he went to a great deal of effort to hide it. Now, Ike played high school baseball in Abilene at Abilene High School. And the summer between high school and West Point, he played for a minor league team in the Kansas State League. And he played for them again the next summer. He did it strictly for the cash. He had no delusions that he was major league material. So can you look up in the record books how he did and how he played? Let me just zoom in, by the way, so we can see Eisenhower here. You can't, because he played under an assumed name, Wilson. Why? Because he knew that playing minor league baseball would bar him from college athletics, and he wanted to play football and baseball at West Point. He did play football, ended up injuring his knee there in a game against James Thorpe. And furthermore, to be a student athlete at West Point, Eisenhower had to sign a pledge saying he had never played professional sports. Well, he lied on that pledge. And if anyone had found out, well, that's a violation of the honor code, and they could have kicked him out. So he kept very quiet about it for obvious reasons. You think about it, if everything that ever happened almost didn't, if he'd been caught, he never would have been a general or president. And even decades later, as president, Eisenhower was very sensitive about this. He didn't really like to talk about it. He called it his big secret. He told his staff that, this is from a White House memo, quote, inquiries should not be answered concerning his participation in professional baseball as it would necessarily become too complicated. So baseball could have cost him the White House, but it didn't. The sport always had a special place in Eisenhower's heart. I found a wonderful quote from Eisenhower recalling a conversation he had with a friend as a small boy. Eisenhower said, I told him I wanted to be a real Major League Baseball player. My friend said that he'd like to be president of the United States. Neither one of us got our wish. Okay, well, let's move on to the topic of presidential close calls, strange but true close calls of presidents. And the first one involves President John Tyler. And the year is 1842, and Tyler is one of hundreds of VIPs aboard the U.S. Navy warship, the Princeton. And he is there because they are going to do a firing demonstration of the biggest naval gun in the world. It's called the Peacemaker. Of course it is. They never call those guns like the Warmonger. It's the Peacemaker. It weighs nearly 13 tons. It can hurl a 228-pound cannonball 5 miles. And so they fire this thing twice. It's very impressive to the crowd. Everybody then heads below for a sumptuous luncheon. And there are toasts, and people start breaking out into song, and it's very convivial. And at some point, then it is announced that they're going to do one more firing of this gun for popular demand. And so everybody starts to bolt for the ladders to get up to deck to see it, including President Tyler. But just as he gets to the bottom of the ladder, his son-in-law at the head table breaks out into this military song. I mean, this was a thing that people did at the time to sort of homespun entertainment at these luncheons. And so Tyler decides that it would be inappropriate for him to leave while his son-in-law is singing. So he pauses at the bottom of the ladder, which is a good thing for President Tyler, because on that third firing, the gun explodes. It's catastrophe. The breech explodes. Jagged chunks of hot iron fly into the crowd on the ship's deck. Both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Navy are killed by the blast. If Tyler had gone on deck, clearly he would have had the place of honor and been killed by the blast. Instead, his life was saved by a song. Pretty spectacular, right? Another president had a close call aboard ship, and here we do finally venture into the World War II time period. It's November 1943, and FDR and his entourage are aboard the USS Iowa on their way to an Allied summit meeting in Tehran. Can you see Roosevelt here? Can you pick him out? I think we can zoom in and see him there at the mic on the ship. And security is tight. I mean, no one outside of this convoy is even supposed to know that Roosevelt has left the country. But suddenly, a torpedo is seen in the water, headed straight for the Iowa. The Germans must have figured it out, and now they're gunning for the president. But in fact, the torpedo comes from an American ship. The escort destroyer USS William D. Porter, known to its crew as the Willie D, has accidentally fired the torpedo during a drill. So pandemonium breaks out in the torpedo room. You have panic on the bridge as they're trying to get in touch with the Iowa to let them know that they've accidentally fired this torpedo. Meantime, on board the Iowa, President Roosevelt, when he hears about this, he says, I want to look over the side. I want to get a better look at this thing. And the Secret Service says, no, and they move him away. And eventually the Iowa is able to maneuver and avoid the torpedo. It goes off. It explodes a couple of 100 yards away from them. The force of the blast rocks the ship. An officer shouts, "My God, we've been hit." But the ship is not harmed. And history records a very successful summit between between Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill, but it might never have happened, right? It might never have happened because everything that ever happened almost didn't. Couldn't even get it out straight that time. You get the message. Back aboard the Willie D, however, things are not so good. The Navy, as it turns out, takes a dim view of its ships shooting at the president. The Porter is escorted to Bermuda, where the entire crew is placed under arrest. One expects that some expletives may have been voiced. About 20 years ago, I talked to one of the survivors of this incident, Bob Jones. He said, "You never saw so many people coming and going, interrogations all night long." And the Navy, they wanted to jail the sailor who pushed the button to fire the torpedo. They wanted to kick everybody on that ship out of the Navy and send them to shore. And FDR said, "No, I'm not going to let you do that." So what they did do is they transferred the captain to a shore billet, and they sent the Porter up to the Aleutian Islands for the rest of the war. I mean, they got the not so pleasant duty up there around the Aleutian Islands. And it is said that when other ships came into contact with the Porter, they would signal her and say, "Don't shoot, we're Republicans." A very interesting postscript to this story is worth mentioning. A year after this happens, the Willie D is hit by kamikaze off of Okinawa. They've now gone down to Okinawa area. So it seems that its reputation as an unlucky ship continues, except it's not really that unlucky because it becomes the only destroyer in World War II to sink without the loss of a single man. And I got a story from Bob Jones, the survivor I mentioned to you. He was wounded in the blast. He was thrown into the water. He passed out. He comes to, he wakes up. He's in a warm bath. Everything is like in a dream. He can't really see. He wonders where he is. 3 beautiful female figures approach. He thinks they are angels. He reaches for them, at which point one of them snaps, "Look, but don't touch, buddy." Turns out they are not angels, but tough as nails Navy nurses cleaning him off for surgery. Heaven had to wait for Bob Jones. So he died about a year ago in Manahawkin, New Jersey, at the age of 93. So just an amazing story. One more close call. So we had a president saved by a song. We had a president saved on the ocean there. Let's end with a president saved by a movie. A president saved by a movie he made 42 years earlier. So you know that means the president has to be Ronald Reagan, because he's the only movie star president that we've had, at least so far. And in 1939, he makes a movie called Code of the Secret Service. And he plays tough guy Secret Service agent Brass Bancroft. And this is not one of Ronald Reagan's great pictures. In fact, he said more than once this was the worst movie he ever made. And if you're familiar with the Reagan oeuvre, that is saying something. But he ends up being really glad he made it. Because down in Miami, this movie captures the imagination of a 10-year-old boy named Jerry Parr. Jerry Parr makes his dad take him to this movie over and over and vows that when he grows up, he's going to become a Secret Service agent himself. And he does. And 42 years later, on March 30th, 1981, Secret Service agent Jerry Parr is part of the detail guarding President Reagan when assassin John Hinckley opens fire. Bang, bang, pandemonium, people ducking for cover. In the midst of the chaos, Parr grabs Reagan, propels the two of them into a waiting car, which speeds off toward the White House. And Jerry Parr looks at Reagan and realizes that Reagan is coughing up blood. He makes the split-second decision to head straight for the hospital. And unbeknownst to either of them, a ricocheting bullet has sliced into Reagan's chest, causing massive internal bleeding. Parr's decision, I'm sorry, for whatever reason, this story always chokes me up. Parr's decision to seek immediate medical care saves the president's life. And you got to admit, even Brass Bancroft couldn't have done better than that. And here is Nancy Reagan thanking Jerry Parr afterward. And a side note on this story, this assassination attempt took place on my very first day in television news. And I'd come in and here in Chicago at WLS television. And, I was supposed to get an orientation, and this happened in the morning, and it was, of course, crazy at the TV station. And they put me in a corner and they said, sit here and don't touch anything. And that was my first day in television. And I've been involved in television and filmmaking ever since for the last 40 years. Okay. Wow. So I am fascinated by origins, how things get started. Like, here's an example, the presidential handshake. In the beginning, presidents didn't shake hands with diplomats or visitors. They bowed to them. George Washington bowed. John Adams bowed. But when Thomas Jefferson became president, he decided to shake it up at a July 4th reception in 1801 with all these European diplomats and elders coming. And so he decided that he was going to shake hands with them instead of bowing. This was kind of shocking. I mean, this was a real change in tradition and protocol. But it stuck. Presidents have been doing the same ever since. So origins intrigue me, especially things so common that we don't think twice about them. Here's one, and I think I can make this work and play this song. know this tune, right? Hail to the Chief, played whenever the president makes a grand entrance. Have you ever stopped how that came to be? I mean, it wasn't written for that purpose. In fact, believe it or not, that's a show tune. It comes from an 1812 stage production of Sir Walter Scott's epic poem, The Lady of the Lake. And it's called, the title of the song in the play is Hail to the Chief. But the chief is not the president of the United States. It's a Scottish Highlander chieftain named Roderick Dhu, who was eventually killed by England's King James. So how does this stage show hit become the president's song? Well, that is due to two first ladies. Let me see if I've got them here. Julia Tyler and Sarah Polk. And it seems that their husbands, John Tyler and James Polk, were a little bit charisma deficient. I mean, you know how there are people, you walk into a room and they will, all attention is centered on them instantly. Tyler and Polk, that's not who they were. They needed a little help in that department. And Tyler actually had another problem, which was that he had taken over when President Harrison died, President William Henry Harrison. So people were not treating him as if he was really the president. In fact, he was referred to as his accidency. So Julia Tyler, the first lady, decided that she wanted to buck up her husband a little bit and that she would have a series of events at the White House, a series of parties, and then as the president made his entrance to kind of draw attention to him, that the Marine Band should play Hail to the Chief. And when Sarah Polk became First Lady, she said, this is a really good idea, except she instructed the band, not just at White House parties, but for any event the president was involved in, that they should play Hail to the Chief so he could make a stirring entrance. And so a tradition is born. And now that you know the story about Hail to the Chief, you can also amaze your friends by telling them two other stories. I'll give you the brief versions, that the music for the Star-Spangled Banner is from an old British drinking song, and that the tune of the Marine Corps hymn comes from an 1860s German comic opera. An 1860s German comic opera, that's where the Marine hymn music comes from. So, but I digress. Let's get back to presidents. Another great political tradition is the so-called smoke-filled room. You know what I'm talking about, where the politicians, the political operators get together to broker a deal behind closed doors with nobody watching, totally out of public view. The smoke-filled room. Well, this comes from 100 years ago, this year. 100 years ago, the Republican National Convention meets here where I am in Chicago, just a few blocks down the street, and a prominent GOP leader from New York named George Harvey checks into a nice suite at the Blackstone Hotel, and which is just, as I say, just down the street. And now nobody remembers George Harvey anymore, but they remember his room at the Blackstone. After 4 ballots, the convention was deadlocked, and so all the Republican leaders gathered for a late-night confab in Harvey's room, and bypassing the frontrunners, they seized on the 4th-place candidate, Warren Harding, as the potential nominee, least offensive to all. So as dawn breaks, AP reporter Kirk Simpson files a story for the Associated Press saying Harding of Ohio was chosen by a group of men in a smoke-filled room early this morning. And once Harding wins the presidency, the smoke-filled room becomes an indispensable part of our presidential lore. And the Blackstone, as I said, it's just a few blocks down the street. And a few years ago, my wife and I generously tipped the concierge there. And we got a tour of the suite, which is now filled with all sorts of smoking paraphernalia. And of course, ironically, it is a no smoking room, so none of that paraphernalia can be used. One more origin story, if you'll play ball with me to pardon what you're about to discover is a terrible pun. Did you know that football's forward pass owes its existence to President Teddy Roosevelt? In fact, college football as we know it might have gone a glimmer if not for TR calling the winning play. It's 1905, and college football is in trouble. The game is so brutal that nearly 100 people have died playing, 18 in that year alone. The public is fed up. Colleges are disbanding teams. As hard to believe as it is right now, state legislatures are considering banning colleges in their state from playing football. And then the president steps in. And Theodore Roosevelt likes football. His son plays at Harvard, but TR's had it up to here with the violence. And so he calls a White House summit and he tells the men who run the game to shape up or ship out. Get the game played on a thoroughly clean basis, he says. Otherwise, he is going to have to ban it. Well, that gets their attention. The possibility of a presidential ban on football. So to avoid that, college officials form a new rules committee to make a bunch of changes in the game. They create penalties for holding and unnecessary roughness. They require teams to go 10 yards instead of 5 yards to get a first down. And then one member of this committee suggests that they do something really wild, open the game up by legalizing the forward pass, which was illegal up to that time. They hope it will reduce the mass collisions in the middle of the field, which are really dangerous. The New York Times calls this a radical idea, and the head of the Rules Committee is opposed to it, but they decide to do it anyway. Oh my God, they're going to change the game. It'll never be the same again. But they do, and they add a rule that says that a forward pass shall be allowed. And it goes into effect in the 1906 season. It doesn't take long for coaches and players to use it. College football's first forward pass takes place on September 22nd, 1906. St. Louis University coach Eddie Cochems calls the play. Quarterback Brad Robinson heaves the ball to Jack Schneider in a game against Carroll College. I want to say, because I always try to be straightforward about things, that this is not a picture from that game. It's just a picture I really like. So good enough, right? As long as we confess that. Anyway, that's the first forward pass, and football is saved for the moment, and at least for the century, thanks to the president who gave us that forward pass. Now, presidents get involved in all sorts of things. Sometimes it works out really well, like in football, and sometimes not so much. Like the time another Roosevelt decided that he was going to mess with Thanksgiving. In 1939, Thanksgiving is scheduled to fall on the last day of November. And retailers are, we're coming out of the Depression. It is an economic difficult time, something we're familiar with today. And the retailers really lobby the president to move Thanksgiving a week earlier to lengthen the Christmas shopping season. And FDR wants to do anything he can to help a still shaky economy, so he agrees. And in the middle of August 1939, now keep this in mind, it's just 3 months before, he casually announces to reporters that Thanksgiving will come a week earlier that year, and the next year as well. And all hell breaks loose. The decision quickly becomes front-page news all over the country. Football coaches and calendar makers are among the most angry, but believe me, it's a long line. There are hundreds and hundreds of political cartoons. Here's one with another football reference, with the president accused of having moved the goalposts of Thanksgiving date and changed the game there. The White House is flooded with letters mocking the president for this decision. Here's one. I'm going to read a little bit of it to you. Mr. President, I see by the paper this morning where you want to change Thanksgiving Day to November 23, of which I heartily approve. Thanks. Now there are some things that I would like done and would appreciate your approval. Have Sunday changed to Wednesday. Have Mondays to be Christmas. Have it strictly against the will of God to work on Tuesday, etc., etc., from Shelby O. Bennett in Shinston, West Virginia. So, but that's just one letter. I had the great pleasure some years ago of visiting the FDR library and going through the boxes of letters and telegrams written to him about this, and people were just wild about it. One of my favorites was a tearful bride whose wedding was going to be on Thanksgiving and now was not going to be on Thanksgiving. It had been planned for a year, and she was just so distraught. And critics of Roosevelt said, well, this new date, it really wasn't going to be Thanksgiving. It was going to be Franksgiving. Franklin Roosevelt. And so the country is really kind of torn in two about this. They're very divided. This is a very complicated map that was published in Newsweek magazine. If you'll bear with me, I'll explain it. It shows that 23 states have decided to celebrate the original date, while 23 states have decided to celebrate the new date. So if we look at Virginia is going to celebrate the new date, November 23rd. But if we look at I don't know, pick one here. I mean, I have trouble seeing this map. It's kind of small. Alabama is going to celebrate the old date, November 30th. And there are two states, Colorado and Texas, who are unable to decide, and they are going to celebrate Thanksgiving on both days. So 2 Thanksgivings that year in Colorado and Texas. The following year, Roosevelt sheepishly admits that the whole thing was a mistake. He returns Thanksgiving to its original date, and Congress passes a law setting that date in stone so that no president can ever again mess with Thanksgiving. There's so many amazing presidential stories. Did you know that John Adams liked to swim in the nude in the Potomac? Thank God that's not a presidential tradition that lasted. Did you know that the Marquis de Lafayette once gave the president an alligator that lived for some months in the White House? Or there's that time that Elvis Presley showed up at the White House unannounced and managed to score himself a meeting with Richard Nixon. I would have really, really, really liked to be present for that one. So let's end with a story that is truly out of this world. One night in 1969, just after dark, a dozen or so men gathered in Leary, Georgia, and they see a strange light in the sky. And most of these men are members of the Leary Lions Club. They're getting together for their regular monthly meeting. The one person who's not a member of that club is an out-of-towner. He's an up-and-coming politician who's come to speak to the club. And fascinated by what he sees in the sky, he makes a beeline for his tape recorder and dictates the details into it because he thinks it's such a remarkable sight. And that man, of course, is Jimmy Carter. And 4 years later, while governor of Georgia, Carter files a UFO report, fills out a form documenting his UFO sighting. I'm sure we'd all love to see that, right? Good news. Here it is. And he describes the UFO as a bright, bluish object nearly the size of the moon that changes color when it moves. Give you a second there just to glance at some of what he wrote out in this UFO report. Obviously, it was something that really hit him. A few years later, when he runs for president, the national media brings this up, naturally. And he turns it aside with a joke. He says, yeah, I saw something. I had no idea what it was. Maybe it was a light beckoning me to run in the California primary. But he never backs down from what he saw. I don't laugh at people anymore when they say they've seen UFOs, he said some years later, because I've seen one myself. And when he becomes president, people hope that he will blow the lid off of what they see as the UFO government cover-up. But once he's president, Carter turns completely mum on the subject and says nothing. So make of that what you will, whatever your feelings are about UFOs. Well, I think it's almost time for me to turn mum, or at least to wrap up and say thank you so much for being with me. And I do want to mention, it was mentioned, John mentioned in the introduction, and I just want to mention that I co-host a weekly live cast Sundays at 4 p.m. called History Happy Hour, not not the hippie hour, History Happy Hour on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. It's not too hard to find. And our guest this Sunday is a World War II related guest. Her name is Catherine Grace Katz, and she's written a book called Daughters of Yalta. So we'll be talking to her. It's actually looking at the Yalta Summit through the eyes of three young women who were there, the daughters of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Averil Harriman. So that's the story there. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has about anything. And I'll hand it back over, though, to the trusty team to do what they need to do so that we can be back with you. Okay.
Rick, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. I love hearing stories like that and bringing history to life. And I'll throw out a trivia question you probably know, but some other people might not. Did you know that John Tyler, whom you mentioned a number of times, actually has a living grandson?
Yeah, he had two until a week or two ago.
Right.
I am fascinated. I have long been fascinated by that fact. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that our perception of time or what happened a long time ago, you can really warp it a little bit. It's little, you can kind of, it's a little mind bending. And that's one example of that. Another example of that I am particularly fond of is that, can I give you two other very briefly, two other examples. One is the fact that these are both things you can Google. There are still whales in the ocean who are alive now, who were alive when Moby Dick was written. So now think about that for a moment. Moby Dick, written in the 1800s. There are some whales live so long that there are probably whales alive today who were alive when Moby Dick was out there and the Pequod was sailing. Of course, it's fictional, but and Captain Ahab and Ishmael and all those guys. So that's like, really? I mean, there are still living creatures from that time. And the second thing is that television was invented before Wyatt Earp died. So to me, that's also another one, like you're crossing the life of Wyatt Earp and the life of television. And in fact, John Wayne, as a young actor, knew Wyatt Earp as an older man and based sort of kind of his Western persona on Wyatt Earp. So when we see a John Wayne performance, we're always getting a little Wyatt Earp there.
Excellent.
So I have a question for you, John. What was, when you do so many stories like that, it's probably hard for people to remember them all. So I always like to ask people, like, what was their favorite so they can remember. What's your favorite story among the presidential ones there?
Oh, I enjoyed the one about Tyler on the ship. Several of them I had heard before, like the Roosevelt stories. And we got a question, incidentally, just before you told about Jimmy Carter and the UFO, and asked if we were going to tell that story, and that you answered that by telling the story. But I will throw one out and amend the question slightly. Do you remember the rabbit attack for Jimmy Carter?
Yeah, I do. I don't remember all the details from it, but I remember that was a great funny news cycle story for a day. There's a lot of weird animals in the White House stories, and I think I wrote a story about animals in the White House. And I mean, there are presidents who grazed sheep on the White House lawn. There have been snakes brought into the White House. I mentioned the alligator. I think there's a few others that I'm not recalling off the top of my head. So I don't know. Whenever animals and presidents go up against each other, it's probably not going to end up well for the president's reputation.
Another question we got was, how do you go about discovering these stories, and which one is your favorite?
Oh, well, so these stories came from my book, The Greatest Presidential Stories Never Told, which was part of a series called The Greatest Stories Never Told, 5 books that I wrote. and that actually themselves then were inspired by a series of history minutes I produced for the History Channel. And so I've researched a ton of these kinds of little known stories. And it's hard, especially I started this before internet research was so ubiquitous. It's a little hard to, if you search, I guess now you can go online and search little known stories, but it's a little tricky to find stuff that you're looking for. So oftentimes what I would do is I read a lot. And so I would see something that I was interested in and kind of make a note, might be just 2 lines in a book or something. And then I would look and try to research that story. But one of the tricks that I did, just a little trick, is when I went to the library to look up a book that might tell me more information about the topic I was interested in, I would always look to the right and to the left of that book for like 6 or 10 books and see if there was anything else there that looked interesting and try to get stuff that way. People will tell me stories that they've heard. Sometimes they're wrong. They're just not true, or they're not true the way they think they are. And sometimes they're a great story. I was in a bar in New Orleans, and somebody told me a story about the writing of Georgia on My Mind, and how the Georgia is really not the state, but it's the sister of Hoagy Carmichael, and that the lyrics were, this whole story, lyrics were written by Hoagy Carmichael's friend. It was the only lyrics he ever wrote. Turned out to be a true story. So you kind of I think you always have to be open. I am particularly attentive to stories with serendipity and unusual aspects to them. And I think if you're open to that, they sort of collect. You collect them, and then you just try to verify them and make sure they're true.
Excellent. Jen, who asked about the UFO, and Jimmy Carter followed up with another question about the rabbit. Is it true that the Secret Service killed the rabbit, or is that just urban legend?
I think so. I don't really remember. I always try to be really careful about delineating the stuff that I really know and the stuff that I think I know, because it's really easy for me to be very authoritative and sit here and go, yes, Jen, that's absolutely true. And but I find that it's always smart to look it up or check it out before you do that, or you have to do one of those awkward backward dances that really don't make you look good. So I think so, Jen. But you look it up, Jen, and tell us.
I don't recall that the Secret Service killed the rabbit, but I could be wrong. He was in a canoe, and the rabbit kind of chased him in the canoe.
Yes, that's right, in the water, right? So. Yeah, I don't know.
We'll have to. That could be in the next book.
That's a next book, next story type thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, related to that, did you run across any stories that a lot of people believe are true and really aren't? And the one of mine that comes to mind is, of course, George Washington and the cherry tree.
Yes, I don't know that I came across a lot in the president's book, but I in fact wanted to write a book called The Greatest Stories That Never Happened, to deal with just that type of story. And my publisher at the time decided that wasn't going to be a best-selling book, so they didn't want to do it. But my favorite example of that is concerns silly putty, oddly enough. There is an urban legend that the astronauts on Apollo 8 took silly putty with them on their journey in space, where they circled the moon and came back, and that they used it to alleviate boredom and they could fix their tools to the side of the spacecraft so you could avoid stuff floating around in the no gravity. And if you go online now, you can find dozens of articles and books that state that as fact. And I thought that was just a great story. I remember when we were doing our original History Minutes for the History Channel, I wanted to include that story. And I said, well, we just should be really sure. And so we reached out to NASA, and we reached out to Binney and Smith, the makers of silly putty, and they both told us no, that it had never happened. But, I really wanted it to be true. So I said, well, maybe the astronauts did it but they didn't tell anybody. And so, it's a cover up. The government and the company don't want us to know. So I said, let's call Jim Lovell, who was the commander of that mission. He's on the mission. I think he was the commander. At any rate, he was on that mission, Apollo 8, and ask him. And we got through to Jim Lovell's secretary. You could hear her asking through the door, and she came back and he says it never happened. And so we couldn't go with that. There's another story that there's a little bit more controversy about, but I also believe never happened, that says that some of Churchill's famous wartime speeches were actually given on the radio by an actor. The BBC version of those speeches, in which he spoke in Parliament, but they weren't broadcast live from Parliament, were given on the radio by an actor who played Larry the Lamb in a radio show. And I have done some research on that and looked into other research. Other people have looked into that as well. It's another thing you can find in all sorts of books. Believe there's no truth to it. There may be some post-war recordings, like records, that were recorded by an actor reading Churchill's speeches just to be able to, but not necessarily. They didn't necessarily claim it was Churchill, but it does not appear that an actor was inspiring Britain over the radio during the Blitz.
Well, excellent. It's sometimes disappointing to find out what didn't happen, but we're slowly letting go of our
But
conclusions.
If I may, and feel free to cut me off at any time, because I do love to talk. So you can stop me at any moment. But that's one of the great things. I've been doing research for so long into the Ghost Army, which is the World War II deception unit that used inflatable tanks and sound effects and illusion to fool the Germans on the battlefields of Europe, and that I'll be talking about there next June. And that's a story where your first reaction to some of this stuff is, well, wait a minute, that can't be true. That's too good to be true. You're telling me that people used inflatable tanks 800 yards from the front lines in Normandy or in Brittany or in Luxembourg against the Germans, that they used sound effects? You're telling me that people impersonated generals to fool enemy spies, and it's all completely true. And so that one is such a great example of the fact that sometimes the seemingly impossible turns out, in fact, to be cut and dried absolute fact.
Well, we are about out of time, so I want to thank you for joining us today. A fascinating talk, and I think we can all look forward to next June 5th when you'll be here in person. And I'm sure between now and then I'll come up with 100 more questions to ask you. But we are greatly looking forward to that, and invite you, as we turn you loose now, to join us for our next Lunchbox lecture with Amanda Williams from the MacArthur Memorial and Winning the Peace, the Occupation of Japan, and all of our other programs. You can always go to dday.org to see what we've got going on and what our next programs are. But Rick, again, I want to thank you for joining us, and thank all of you who've been watching and all who are going to watch it later on. We greatly appreciate it and look forward to joining you again.
Thank you so much.